The evening sun cast long shadows across the quiet suburban streets as Officer Gregg drove his patrol car along the familiar roads. He had been assigned to this neighborhood for nearly a decade, and he prided himself on knowing its rhythms, the comings and goings of residents, the usual faces, and the occasional strangers who stood out. But today something felt different. As he rounded a corner, his eyes landed on a man walking briskly down the sidewalk. The man wore a dark hoodie pulled low over his head, and he carried a sleek black briefcase in one hand. His pace was quick, almost hurried, and there was an air of purpose about him that caught Officer Gregg's attention. Officer Gregg's instincts kicked in immediately, though they were tinged with something deeper, a bias he wasn't fully aware of but couldn't ignore. The man didn't fit the image of someone who belonged here, at least not in Officer Gregg's mind. This was a predominantly white, middle-class neighborhood, and the sight of a black man dressed casually, yet carrying a professional-looking briefcase seemed incongruous to him. Without giving it much thought, Officer Gregg flicked on the flashing lights of his patrol car and pulled up behind the man. Through the loudspeaker, he barked, "Stop right there! Hands where I can see them!" The man froze mid-step, clearly startled by the sudden command. Slowly he turned around, his hands rising into the air. His name was Marcus Johnson, a 35-year-old engineer who had spent the last 5 years working on cutting-edge defense technology projects. Earlier that day, he'd attended a meeting with local contractors to discuss logistics for a new project. Now, exhausted from hours of presentations and negotiations, all he wanted was to get home to his family. But the sound of a police siren shattered that hope in an instant. Standing under the weight of suspicion, Marcus tried to remain calm, his mind racing to make sense of what was happening. As Officer Gregg stepped out of his car, his hand instinctively moved toward his holster. His eyes scanned Marcus from head to toe, taking in every detail, the hoodie, the briefcase, the way Marcus held himself. To Officer Gregg, none of it added up. Why was this man walking so fast? Where was he coming from? And why did he look so nervous now? These questions swirled in his mind, but instead of asking them aloud, he let his assumptions guide his actions. "What are you doing here?" he demanded, his voice sharp and accusatory. Marcus swallowed hard, trying to steady his breathing. "I live nearby," he replied, keeping his tone even and respectful despite the tension crackling in the air. But Officer Gregg wasn't convinced. "You don't belong here," he shot back, his words laced with skepticism. "Show me some ID." Marcus nodded slowly, careful not to make any sudden movements. "Okay, officer, I'll show you my ID," he said, reaching for his wallet in his back pocket. But before Marcus could even pull it out, Officer Gregg shouted, "Stop right there." His hand tightened around the grip of his gun, his finger hovering near the trigger. Panic surged through Marcus as he realized how dangerous the situation had become. He raised his hands higher, palms open, and spoke slowly and deliberately. "Sir, I'm unarmed. I'm just trying to show you my ID. Please let me do that." Despite his efforts to stay composed, his heart pounded in his chest. He knew that one wrong move could turn this encounter deadly. Officer Gregg hesitated for a moment, his gaze locked onto Marcus. Something about the man's demeanor, his calmness, his measured words, didn't align with the narrative forming in Officer Gregg's mind. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. "Get on your knees," he ordered, gesturing with his gun. Marcus complied, lowering himself carefully to the ground. The rough pavement scraped against his knees, but he bit back, the discomfort focusing instead on surviving this ordeal. Officer Gregg approached cautiously, his weapon still drawn, and began patting Marcus down. Each movement was clinical, impersonal, as if Marcus were nothing more than a potential threat to be neutralized. By now, neighbors had started to notice the commotion. Some peered out from behind their curtains, curiosity mingling with unease. A few stepped outside, phones in hand, capturing video footage of the scene unfolding before them. Whispers rippled through the crowd, speculations flying about what might have led to this confrontation. For Marcus, the presence of onlookers only deepened his humiliation. Here he was, a respected professional, reduced to kneeling on the ground, in front of his own community, treated like a criminal simply because of the color of his skin. Yet, amidst the shame and fear, A small part of him refused to give up. He needed to find a way to defuse the situation. Taking a deep breath, Marcus spoke again, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. "Officer, please listen to me. If you call the Pentagon, they'll confirm who I am." It was a bold statement, one that seemed almost absurd in the context of the moment. Officer Gregg stared at him, incredulous. Was this guy serious? What kind of person claimed to have ties to the Pentagon? Surely it was a desperate attempt to talk his way out of trouble. But something about the way Marcus delivered those words gave Officer Gregg pause. There was no hint of panic or deception in his voice, just quiet confidence. For a split second, doubt crept into Officer Gregg's mind. What if this man really was telling the truth? Reluctantly, he decided to test the claim. Pulling out his phone, he dialed the number Marcus provided. The call connected almost instantly, and a voice on the other end answered professionally. After exchanging a few words, Officer Gregg's expression shifted from skepticism to shock. The person on the line confirmed Marcus's identity without hesitation, adding that he was involved in highly sensitive work for the Department of Defense. They emphasized the importance of his role and urged Officer Gregg to treat him with the utmost respect. Hanging up the phone, Officer Gregg felt a wave of disbelief wash over him. His assumptions, his suspicions, they had all been wrong. The man kneeling before him wasn't a threat. He was a key player in national security efforts. Slowly, Officer Gregg lowered his gun, stepping back as the gravity of the situation hit him. For the first time since the encounter began, he truly saw Marcus, not as a stereotype or a perceived danger, but as a human being deserving of dignity. Marcus rose to his feet, brushing dirt off his clothes. His face remained impassive, masking the storm of emotions swirling within him. Anger, frustration, relief, all of it bubbled just beneath the surface, waiting for release. But instead of lashing out, he chose his words carefully. Looking directly at Officer Gregg, he said, "You see me as a threat because of how I look, don't you? You didn't stop to ask questions or consider that I might belong here. All you saw was my skin color, and that was enough for you to assume the worst." His words hung heavy in the air, piercing through the tension like a knife. Officer Gregg felt them sink deep into his conscience, forcing him to confront the uncomfortable truth. He had acted on impulse, letting ingrained biases dictate his behavior. Now faced with the reality of his mistake, he struggled to find the right response. Silence stretched between them, broken only by the distant hum of traffic and the murmurs of curious neighbors still watching from afar. In that charged moment, neither man moved nor spoke. The world seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Officer Gregg's mind raced, replaying the events of the past few minutes and grappling with the weight of his actions. Meanwhile, Marcus stood tall, his posture radiating resilience despite everything he had endured. Though the immediate danger had passed, the scars of the encounter would linger, for both men and for the community that bore witness to it. As the gravity of the situation settled over Officer Gregg, he found himself caught in a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Shame, embarrassment, and guilt tugged at him, each one vying for dominance. He had always prided himself on being a fair and dedicated officer, someone who served his community with integrity. But now, standing face to face with Marcus, he couldn't deny the truth. His actions had been driven by prejudice. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut, leaving him momentarily speechless. For years he had told himself that he wasn't racist, that he treated everyone equally under the law. Yet here he was, holding an innocent man at gunpoint simply because of the color of his skin. Marcus, meanwhile, was doing everything he could to maintain his composure. Inside, he was a storm of anger and frustration. But outwardly he remained calm and collected. He knew that reacting emotionally would only escalate the situation further, and he wanted nothing more than to get home safely to his wife and children. Still, the weight of what had just happened pressed heavily on him. He thought about all the times he'd been judged unfairly because of his race, all the microaggressions and dismissive glances he'd endured throughout his life. This moment felt like the culmination of every injustice he'd ever faced, magnified by the fact that it had occurred in broad daylight. in front of his neighbors no less. The silence between them stretched on, broken only by the faint rustle of leaves in the evening breeze. Finally, Officer Gregg managed to choke out a few words. I didn't know," he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "I made a mistake." It was a feeble attempt at an apology, but Marcus heard the sincerity behind it. He nodded slowly, acknowledging the effort without letting his guard down completely. "You're not the first person to make assumptions about me," Marcus said, his tone measured but firm. "But when those assumptions lead to situations like this, they can have serious consequences." Officer Gregg flinched at the remark, knowing full well how true it was. In his line of work, split-second decisions often meant the difference between life and death. Today, his decision had nearly cost Marcus his life, and all because of a baseless assumption. As much as he wanted to defend himself, to explain that he was just doing his job, he knew there was no excuse for what he had done. Instead, he took a step back, holstering his weapon and running a hand through his hair. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice tinged with uncertainty. Marcus exhaled deeply, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. "That's up to you," he replied. "You can choose to learn from this or let it define you. Either way, I'll be fine. I've dealt with worse." His words carried a quiet strength, a resilience born from years of navigating a world that often saw him as less than he was. Officer Gregg nodded slowly, absorbing the weight of Marcus's response. He realized that this wasn't just about him. It was about the system he represented, a system that too often failed people like Marcus. By now, the crowd of onlookers had grown larger, their murmurs growing louder as they speculated about what had transpired. Some recorded the scene on their phones while others exchanged hushed conversations. Among them was Mrs. Thompson, a longtime resident of the neighborhood who had known Marcus for years. She stepped forward, her expression a mix of concern and indignation. "Marcus, are you okay?" she called out, her voice cutting through the tension. Marcus turned to her, offering a small, reassuring smile. "I'm fine, Mrs. Thompson," he said. "Thank you for asking." Mrs. Thompson then turned her gaze toward Officer Gregg, her eyes narrowing in disapproval. "Do you even know who this man is?" she demanded, her tone sharp. "He's one of us, a valued member of this community. How dare you treat him like this?" Her words struck a nerve, not just with Officer Gregg, but with others in the crowd as well. A few people nodded in agreement, while others looked away uncomfortably, unwilling to confront the uncomfortable truths bubbling to the surface. Officer Gregg felt the weight of their collective judgment pressing down on him. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. What could he say to justify his actions? Anything he offered would sound hollow, especially in light of what had just been revealed. Instead, he stood there, his uniform feeling heavier than ever, a symbol of authority that now seemed tainted by his own biases. For the first time in his career, he felt truly powerless. Marcus noticed the shift in Officer Gregg's demeanor and decided to take the opportunity to drive home a point. "This isn't just about me," he said, addressing both the officer and the growing audience. "It's about how we treat each other as human beings. When you see someone who looks different from you, do you automatically assume the worst? Do you let fear dictate your actions? If so, then we're all losing something important, our humanity." His words resonated with many in the crowd, sparking nods of agreement and murmurs of support. Even Officer Gregg found himself listening intently, unable to ignore the wisdom in Marcus's message. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the street in a soft orange glow, the atmosphere began to shift. The initial hostility gave way to a sense of reflection, as if the entire neighborhood was taking stock of what had just happened. Officer Gregg finally broke the silence, his voice trembling with emotion. "I'm sorry," he said, looking directly at Marcus. "I messed up, and I need to do better. Not just for you, but for everyone." It was a simple admission, but it carried a weight that went beyond mere words. Marcus studied him for a moment, searching for any sign of insincerity. Finding none, he extended his hand, a gesture of reconciliation. "We all make mistakes," he said softly. What matters is what we do after we realize them. Officer Gregg hesitated for a brief second before reaching out and shaking Marcus's hand. The act felt symbolic, a small step toward healing the rift that had formed between them. The crowd began to disperse slowly, some people lingering to offer words of encouragement to Marcus while others walked away deep in thought. Mrs. Thompson stayed behind, placing a comforting hand on Marcus's shoulder. "If you need anything, don't hesitate to ask," she said warmly. Marcus thanked her, grateful for the support. As he gathered his belongings and prepared to head home, he couldn't help but feel a glimmer of hope. Yes, the encounter had been harrowing, but it had also sparked a conversation, one that might lead to meaningful change. Back at the station later that night, Officer Gregg sat alone in his car, replaying the events of the day in his mind. He thought about Marcus's words, about the look of disappointment in Mrs. Thompson's eyes, and about the murmurs of the crowd. He knew that apologizing wasn't enough. Real change required action. With a newfound determination, he resolved to educate himself, to challenge the biases he hadn't even realized he harbored. He also vowed to speak up within his department, advocating for reforms that would prevent similar incidents from happening in the future. Word of the incident spread quickly, fueled by social media posts and local news coverage. By morning, it had become a topic of discussion across the city, sparking debates about racial profiling, systemic bias, and police accountability. Many praised Marcus for his poise and courage, while others criticized Officer Gregg for his lapse in judgment. Amidst the noise, however, there were voices of reason, people calling for dialogue, understanding, and progress. Both Marcus and Officer Gregg found themselves thrust into the spotlight, their lives forever changed by the events of that fateful evening. For Marcus, the experience reinforced his commitment to advocacy. He began speaking at community forums, sharing his story and urging others to confront their own biases. He also collaborated with local organizations to promote diversity and inclusion initiatives, using his platform to effect positive change. Officer Gregg, meanwhile, threw himself into training programs designed to address implicit bias and improve community relations. Though the road ahead was long and fraught with challenges, both men remained hopeful that their actions could pave the way for a brighter future. In the weeks that followed, the neighborhood underwent a subtle transformation. Conversations that had once been avoided were now being held openly, fostering a sense of unity and shared purpose. While the scars of that evening would never fully fade, they served as a reminder of the power of empathy, accountability, and growth. And though their paths had crossed under painful circumstances, Marcus and Officer Gregg became unlikely symbols of progress, a testament to the idea that even in moments of conflict, understanding and redemption are possible. The days following the incident were a blur for both Marcus and Officer Gregg, each grappling with the aftermath in their own way. For Marcus, life didn't stop. He still had responsibilities, meetings to attend, projects to oversee, and a family to care for. But the encounter lingered in his mind like an unwelcome shadow, haunting him at odd moments. He couldn't shake the memory of kneeling on the cold pavement, the weight of Officer Gregg's gun pointed at him, or the stares of his neighbors watching as if he were some kind of spectacle. It wasn't the first time he'd faced racism, but this felt different. This time, it had happened so publicly, so brazenly, that it left him questioning whether things would ever truly change. At home, Marcus tried to shield his wife and children from the details of what had occurred. His wife, Lisa, was sharp-eyed and perceptive, though, and she could tell something was wrong. "You've been quiet all evening," she said one night as they sat together on the couch, the kids asleep upstairs. Her voice was gentle but probing. Marcus hesitated before responding, unsure of how much to share. Finally, he sighed and told her everything. The patrol car pulling up behind him, the harsh commands, the gun drawn, and the humiliating search in front of their neighbors. As he spoke, his voice cracked with emotion, revealing the depth of his pain. Lisa listened silently, her hand resting on his knee until he finished. Then she wrapped her arms around him, holding him tightly, as tears welled up in his eyes. "You didn't deserve that," Lisa whispered fiercely. "No one does." Her words brought him a small measure of comfort, but they also reminded him of the larger issue at hand. This wasn't just about him. It was about every black person who had ever been treated unfairly because of the color of their skin. That realization fueled his resolve. Over the next few days, Marcus began reaching out to community leaders and activists, sharing his story and exploring ways to turn this painful experience into something meaningful. He knew he couldn't single-handedly dismantle systemic racism, but he could contribute to the conversation, adding his voice to the chorus of those demanding change. Meanwhile, Officer Gregg struggled to process what had happened. The image of Marcus kneeling on the ground haunted him, replaying in his mind whenever he closed his eyes. At work, he went through the motions, patrolling the streets and filing reports, but his heart wasn't in it. He felt disconnected from the job he once loved, plagued by doubts about whether he was cut out for it anymore. His colleagues noticed the shift in his demeanor but didn't press him for details. Some offered platitudes like, "These things happen," or "You did what you thought was right." But none of it helped. Deep down, Officer Gregg knew he couldn't justify his actions, no matter how hard he tried. One evening, after another long and restless day, Officer Gregg decided to visit a local bar. He rarely drank, but tonight he needed something to dull the ache in his chest. Sitting alone at the counter, nursing a beer, he found himself thinking about Marcus's words. "You see me as a threat because of how I look." Those words echoed in his mind, forcing him to confront uncomfortable truths about himself. Had he really judged Marcus based solely on his appearance? The thought made him cringe, yet he couldn't deny it. Growing up, he had been taught to view certain groups of people as inherently suspicious, a lesson reinforced by years of societal conditioning. Now, for the first time, he saw how deeply those biases had taken root, and how dangerous they could be. As the night wore on, Officer Gregg struck up a conversation with the bartender, a middle-aged woman named Sarah who had lived in the area for decades. She recognized him immediately, having heard about the incident involving Marcus. Rather than berate him, she listened patiently as he poured out his frustrations and fears. "I don't know what to do," he admitted, his voice heavy with regret. "I messed up, and I don't know how to fix it." Sarah nodded thoughtfully, her expression sympathetic but firm. "Maybe start by listening," she suggested. "People are hurting and they want to be heard. Sometimes that's the first step toward making things right." Her advice stuck with Officer Gregg long after he left the bar. Over the next few weeks, he began attending community meetings hosted by local advocacy groups. These gatherings were often tense, filled with raw emotions and difficult conversations about race, policing, and accountability. At first, Officer Gregg felt out of place, unsure of how to contribute. But as he listened to the stories shared by residents, stories of profiling, discrimination, and mistrust, he started to understand the magnitude of the problem. One particular story stood out to him, a young black teenager recounting how he had been stopped multiple times while walking home from school, simply because he didn't look like he belonged. Hearing this first-hand account hit close to home, reminding him of his own interaction with Marcus. Inspired by these experiences, Officer Gregg began taking steps to address his biases. He enrolled in sensitivity training programs offered by his department, immersing himself in workshops designed to challenge ingrained stereotypes and promote empathy. He also sought guidance from mentors within the force who had championed reform efforts in the past. Their advice was straightforward yet impactful. Acknowledge your mistakes, commit to learning, and use your position to advocate for change. Slowly but surely, Officer Gregg began to feel a renewed sense of purpose. He realized that while he couldn't undo what had happened, he could work to ensure it didn't happen again, to anyone. Back in the neighborhood, the ripple effects of the incident continued to unfold. Local media coverage brought widespread attention to the story, sparking debates across the city. Some praised Marcus for his composure and courage, hailing him as a hero for standing up against injustice. Others criticized Officer Gregg, calling for disciplinary action and stricter oversight of law enforcement practices. Amidst the polarized reactions, however, there were also calls for unity and understanding. Community leaders organized forums where residents could come together to discuss issues of race and policing openly. Marcus attended several of these events, using his platform to encourage dialogue and push for tangible reforms. One such forum proved particularly transformative. Held in the auditorium of a nearby high school, the event drew a diverse crowd of attendees, young and old, black and white, police officers and civilians alike. When it was Marcus's turn to speak, he stepped onto the stage with quiet confidence. Looking out at the sea of faces, he recounted his experience in vivid detail, describing not only the fear and humiliation he had felt, but also the hope he held for the future. "We can't ignore the problems we face as a society," he said, his voice steady and resolute, "but we also can't let anger and division define us. We have to talk to each other, listen to each other, and find solutions together." His words resonated deeply with the audience, earning applause and nods of agreement. Even Officer Greg, who sat quietly in the back row, found himself moved by Marcus's message. After the event, he approached Marcus cautiously, extending a tentative handshake. "Thank you for speaking tonight," he said sincerely. It means a lot." Marcus accepted the gesture, offering a slight smile. "We're all part of this community," he replied. "If we want things to improve, we have to work together." Their brief exchange marked a turning point in their relationship. Though they weren't friends, in fact, they barely knew each other, they shared a mutual respect forged through adversity. Both men understood that real progress required effort and sacrifice, not just from individuals, but from institutions as well. With this in mind, they collaborated on initiatives aimed at bridging the gap between law enforcement and the communities they served. Officer Greg became a vocal advocate for policy changes within his department, pushing for increased transparency, better training, and stronger accountability measures. Marcus, meanwhile, worked tirelessly to amplify marginalized voices, ensuring that stories like his reached as many ears as possible. As months passed, the neighborhood began to transform in subtle but significant ways. Conversations that had once been avoided were now happening regularly, fostering a culture of openness and trust. Police officers started participating in community events, engaging with residents in non-confrontational settings. Schools introduced programs focused on diversity and inclusion, teaching students the importance of empathy and respect. Even small gestures, like neighbors greeting each other more warmly or organizing block parties, contributed to a growing sense of solidarity. Of course, challenges remained. Change didn't happen overnight, and there were setbacks along the way. Some residents resisted new policies, clinging to outdated beliefs. Others grew frustrated with the slow pace of progress, feeling that promises weren't being kept. Yet despite these obstacles, the momentum continued to build. Each success, no matter how minor, served as a reminder that collective action could yield results. For Marcus and Officer Greg, the journey was far from over. They both carried scars from that fateful evening, emotional wounds that would take time to heal. But they also carried lessons learned and connections forged, reminders of the power of resilience and redemption. In a world often divided by fear and misunderstanding, they had chosen to stand as symbols of hope, proving that, even in the darkest moments, light could shine through. And though their paths had crossed under painful circumstances, as weeks turned into months, the impact of Marcus's encounter with Officer Greg continued to reverberate throughout the community. What had started as a single, isolated incident had grown into a catalyst for broader discussions about race, policing, and accountability. The story became a touchstone for many, a vivid example of how deeply ingrained biases could manifest in dangerous ways, but also a testament to the possibility of growth and reconciliation. For Marcus and Officer Greg, the experience remained a defining moment in their lives, shaping not only their personal journeys, but also the roles they played in driving change. Marcus threw himself into advocacy work with renewed vigor. He began speaking at schools, churches, and community centers, sharing his story with anyone who would listen. His presentations were always thoughtful and measured, blending personal anecdotes with data-driven insights about racial profiling and systemic inequality. He didn't shy away from discussing the emotional toll of his experience, describing the fear he felt when Officer Gregg drew his gun and the humiliation of being treated like a criminal in front of his neighbors. Yet he balanced these raw emotions with messages of hope and resilience, urging audiences to channel their anger into action. "Change doesn't happen overnight," he often said, "but every conversation we have, every step we take toward understanding each other brings us closer to a better future." His efforts quickly gained traction, earning him invitations to speak at larger events beyond the neighborhood. One such opportunity came when a local university invited him to deliver the keynote address at its annual Diversity Summit. Standing on stage in front of hundreds of students, faculty members, and community leaders, Marcus reflected on the long road ahead. "We live in a society that has been shaped by centuries of inequality," he began, his voice steady yet impassioned. "Breaking down those structures won't be easy, but it's necessary if we want to create a world where everyone feels safe and valued." His words resonated deeply with the audience, sparking standing ovations and prompting follow-up discussions that lasted long after the event ended. Officer Gregg, too, found himself stepping into unfamiliar territory as he embraced his role as an advocate for reform within law enforcement. Initially hesitant to share his side of the story, he eventually agreed to participate in panel discussions alongside Marcus and other community leaders. These forums provided a platform for honest dialogue, allowing residents to voice their concerns directly to police officers. At first, Officer Gregg struggled to articulate his thoughts, often stumbling over his words as he grappled with feelings of guilt and inadequacy. But with practice and encouragement from colleagues and mentors, he grew more confident in addressing tough questions head-on. One particularly memorable discussion took place at a town hall meeting organized by a coalition of local organizations. Dozens of residents packed into the room, some eager to engage in constructive conversations while others arrived with skepticism and frustration. When it was Officer Gregg's turn to speak, he took a deep breath before addressing the crowd. "I made a terrible mistake," he admitted, his voice trembling slightly. "I let my assumptions get the best of me, and I hurt someone because of it. That's something I'll carry with me for the rest of my life." Pausing for a moment, he looked around the room, meeting the eyes of those seated closest to him. "But I'm here tonight because I want to make things right, not just for myself, but for all of you. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that silence only perpetuates injustice. We need to keep talking even when it's uncomfortable." His candor earned mixed reactions. Some attendees applauded his willingness to confront his mistakes, seeing it as a sign of genuine remorse. Others remained skeptical, questioning whether his actions represented meaningful progress or mere lip service. A young woman in the front row raised her hand during the Q&A session, her expression guarded. "How do we know you're serious about changing?" she asked bluntly. Officer Gregg nodded, acknowledging the validity of her concern. "You don't," he replied honestly. "And I don't expect you to trust me overnight. All I can do is show up consistently, listen to your feedback, and prove through my actions that I'm committed to doing better." The young woman seemed taken aback by his response, but she nodded slowly, appearing to consider his words. Moments like these reminded Officer Gregg of the importance of humility. He knew he couldn't erase the harm he had caused, nor could he expect immediate forgiveness. What he could do, however, was demonstrate his commitment to learning and growth. Over time, his consistent presence at community events and his active involvement in reform initiatives began to earn him a measure of respect, even from those who had initially doubted his sincerity. Meanwhile, the relationship between Marcus and Officer Gregg evolved in unexpected ways. Though they weren't close friends, they developed a working partnership rooted in mutual respect and shared goals. They collaborated on several projects aimed at improving police-community relations, including a mentorship program that paired officers with youth from underserved neighborhoods. The program focused on building trust through open communication, offering participants opportunities to learn from one another in informal settings. For many of the young people involved, interacting with officers outside the context of enforcement helped humanize them, breaking down stereotypes on both sides. The duo also worked together to develop training modules for new recruits, emphasizing the importance of cultural competence and de-escalation techniques. Drawing on their own experiences, they crafted scenarios designed to challenge officers' assumptions and encourage critical thinking. During one session, Marcus recounted his encounter with Officer Gregg, using it as a case study to illustrate the dangers of implicit bias. Imagine how differently things might have gone if Officer Gregg had taken a moment to ask questions instead of jumping to conclusions, he told the group. It's not just about avoiding mistakes, it's about treating people with dignity and respect, regardless of the situation. These efforts did not go unnoticed. Local media outlets began highlighting the progress being made in the community, showcasing stories of collaboration and transformation. A feature article in the city's largest newspaper praised Marcus and Officer Gregg for their leadership, calling them unlikely allies in the fight against systemic racism. The piece included quotes from residents who credited their work with fostering a greater sense of unity and understanding. While some critics dismissed the coverage as overly optimistic, dismissing the challenges that still lay ahead, most readers found inspiration in the narrative of redemption and cooperation. Despite the positive momentum, challenges persisted. Resistance to change came from various quarters, including within the police department itself. Some veteran officers viewed the reforms as unnecessary or even threatening, fearing that increased scrutiny would undermine their authority. Tensions occasionally flared during internal meetings, with heated debates erupting over proposed policy changes. Officer Gregg faced criticism from certain colleagues who accused him of betraying the Brotherhood by aligning himself with activists. Though these conflicts weighed heavily on him, he refused to back down, drawing strength from the support he received from reform-minded peers and community members. Similarly, Marcus encountered pushback from individuals who believed he was being too lenient in his approach. "Why are you working with the police?" one man demanded during a community forum. "They're the problem." Marcus listened patiently before responding. "I understand your frustration," he said calmly. "Believe me, I've felt it myself. But shutting ourselves off from dialogue won't solve anything. If we want real change, we have to engage, even when it's hard." His ability to remain composed in the face of hostility earned him admiration from many, reinforcing his reputation as a voice of reason and resilience. Amidst the ups and downs, small victories kept spirits high. Neighbors reported feeling safer knowing that officers were making an effort to connect with them on a personal level. Parents expressed gratitude for programs that gave their children positive interactions with law enforcement. Even subtle shifts, like officers attending block parties or joining cleanup efforts, helped foster goodwill and rebuild trust. Each success, no matter how minor, served as a reminder that progress was possible, even in the face of entrenched resistance. By the end of the year, the community had undergone noticeable changes. Conversations about race and policing were no longer taboo. Instead, they were seen as essential components of building a stronger, more inclusive society. Schools incorporated lessons on empathy and equity into their curricula, encouraging students to think critically about social issues. Businesses pledged to prioritize diversity in hiring practices, recognizing the value of representation. And perhaps most significantly, relationships between residents and law enforcement began to improve, laying the groundwork for sustained collaboration. For Marcus and Officer Gregg, the journey was far from over. They both understood that dismantling systemic racism required ongoing effort and vigilance. Yet, as they looked back on everything they had accomplished together, they felt a profound sense of fulfillment. Their story a tale of conflictances. As the months rolled on, the ripple effects of Marcus and Officer Gregg's efforts began to spread far beyond their immediate community. What had started as localized initiatives, mentorship programs, training modules, and town hall meetings grew into a movement that captured the attention of neighboring cities and even state officials. The story of their unlikely partnership became a symbol of what could be achieved when people chose empathy over division and collaboration over conflict. It wasn't perfect, and there were still hurdles to overcome, but the progress they made inspired others to take similar steps in their own communities. One significant development came when a regional conference on criminal justice reform invited both Marcus and Officer Gregg to speak as keynote panelists. The event drew hundreds of attendees from across the state, including law enforcement officers, policymakers, activists, and academics. For Marcus, it was an opportunity to amplify his message on a larger stage, while for Officer Gregg, it represented a chance to share his journey of self-reflection and accountability with a wider audience. As they sat side by side at the front of the auditorium preparing to address the crowd, they exchanged a glance, a silent acknowledgement of how far they had come since that tense evening months earlier. When it was Marcus's turn to speak, he began by recounting the details of his encounter with Officer Gregg, painting a vivid picture of the fear and frustration he had felt. But rather than dwell solely on the negative aspects, he quickly shifted to discussing the lessons learned and the opportunities for growth that arose from the experience. "That day changed me," he said, his voice steady yet filled with emotion. "It reminded me of how systemic racism operates, not just through overt acts of hatred, but through subtle biases that influence decisions we don't even realize we're making. But it also showed me that change is possible when we confront those biases head-on." He went on to describe the collaborative projects he and Officer Gregg had spearheaded, emphasizing the importance of dialogue and mutual understanding. "We're not saying everything is fixed now," Marcus added. "Far from it. There's still so much work to do. But every conversation, every policy change, every effort to build trust brings us one step closer to a more equitable society." His words resonated deeply with the audience, many of whom nodded in agreement or scribbled notes in their notebooks. Officer Gregg followed Marcus's remarks with a speech of his own, though his delivery was noticeably more hesitant. He spoke about the shame and guilt he had carried after realizing the harm he had caused, describing how those emotions had driven him to seek out ways to make amends. "I used to think I was immune to bias," he admitted, his voice tinged with vulnerability. "I thought I treated everyone fairly because I didn't harbor any explicit prejudices. But what happened with Marcus taught me that bias isn't always conscious. It's embedded in our systems, our institutions, and sometimes even in ourselves. Acknowledging that truth was painful, but it was necessary if I wanted to grow." He then highlighted specific reforms he had championed within his department, such as revising use of force policies, implementing mandatory cultural competency training, and creating channels for residents to provide feedback directly to leadership. "None of these changes would have been possible without listening to the community," Officer Gregg said, gesturing toward Marcus and other advocates in the room. "They held us accountable, pushed us to do better, and ultimately helped us become stronger as an organization. It hasn't always been easy, but it's worth it." The applause that followed their presentations was thunderous, reflecting the admiration and respect the audience felt for their courage and commitment. Afterward, dozens of attendees lined up to speak with them personally, eager to learn more about their strategies and experiences. Some shared stories of their own struggles with racial profiling or police misconduct, while others sought advice on how to initiate similar reforms in their hometowns. Both Marcus and Officer Gregg listened intently, offering guidance where they could and encouraging others to take action in their own contexts. Back home, the momentum continued to build. Inspired by the success of the mentorship program, Marcus and Officer Gregg expanded its scope to include workshops focused on conflict resolution and emotional intelligence. These sessions brought together diverse groups of participants, young people, educators, business owners, and law enforcement officers, to practice skills like active listening, perspective-taking, and finding common ground. One participant, a high school teacher named Ms. Alvarez, later described the experience as transformative. "I've lived in this community my whole life," she said during a debrief session. "But until now I never really understood what it feels like to walk in someone else's shoes. This program has opened my eyes in ways I didn't expect." The positive impact extended beyond interpersonal relationships, influencing broader institutional practices as well. Local businesses began adopting diversity and inclusion initiatives, recognizing the value of representation in leadership roles. Schools implemented restorative justice programs aimed at addressing disciplinary disparities among students of different racial backgrounds. Even city council meetings saw increased participation from residents who felt empowered to advocate for meaningful policy changes. The sense of collective ownership over the community's future grew stronger with each passing month. Of course, not everyone embraced these changes with open arms. Skeptics remained, particularly among older generations or individuals resistant to altering long-standing traditions. Some argued that focusing too much on race risked dividing the community further, while others dismissed the reforms as superficial, gestures lacking substance. A few vocal critics accused Marcus and Officer Gregg of seeking personal glory rather than genuine improvement. Despite these criticisms, however, the overall trajectory leaned toward progress. The sheer number of people actively engaged in the movement, whether by attending events, volunteering their time, or simply engaging in conversations with neighbors, demonstrated a widespread desire for change. Amidst all the activity, Marcus and Officer Gregg found moments of quiet reflection to process the magnitude of what they had accomplished. Late one evening, after co-leading a workshop on implicit bias, they sat together on a park bench overlooking the neighborhood playground. Children laughed and played under the soft glow of streetlights, their carefree energy a stark contrast to the weighty topics they had discussed earlier that day. For a while, neither man spoke, content to simply observe the scene before them. Finally, Marcus broke the silence. "Do you ever wonder if we're doing enough?" he asked, his tone contemplative. Officer Gregg exhaled slowly, considering the question. "Every day," he replied honestly. "There's always more we could be doing, more voices we could be lifting up. Sometimes it feels overwhelming." Marcus nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Yeah, I get that. But then I remind myself of something my dad used to say. Progress isn't about perfection. It's about persistence. We might not fix everything overnight, but as long as we keep showing up, we're moving in the right direction." Officer. Gregg smiled faintly, appreciating the wisdom in Marcus's words. "Persistence," he echoed softly. "I can live with that." They sat in companionable silence for a few more minutes before rising to head home, each carrying a renewed sense of purpose. As the year drew to a close, the community celebrated its achievements with a special event dubbed Unity Day. Organized jointly by local leaders, residents, and law enforcement representatives, the gathering featured food trucks, live music, art exhibits, and interactive booths highlighting ongoing initiatives. At the heart of the festivities stood a mural commissioned by a group of young artists depicting scenes of collaboration and resilience. Prominently featured in the artwork were portraits of Marcus and Officer Gregg, standing shoulder to shoulder beneath the words, "Together we rise." During a brief ceremony, the mayor presented both men with awards recognizing their contributions to fostering unity and driving reform. As they accepted the honors, the crowd erupted into cheers, holding up signs bearing messages like, "Change starts here," and "Justice for all." Though humbled by the recognition, Marcus and Officer Gregg knew the real reward lay in seeing their efforts bear fruit, not just in policies or programs, but in the everyday interactions that reflected a growing spirit of compassion and cooperation. Looking ahead, they remained committed to sustaining the momentum they had built. Plans were already underway to establish a permanent advisory board tasked with monitoring progress and identifying areas for further improvement. Additionally, partnerships with universities and research institutions promised to bring data-driven insights into discussions about equity and inclusion. While challenges undoubtedly lay ahead, Marcus and Officer Gregg faced them with optimism, buoyed by the knowledge that they weren't alone in this fight. Their story served as a powerful reminder that transformation begins with individual choices to listen, to learn, and to act with integrity. By choosing to confront their biases and work toward reconciliation, Marcus and Officer Gregg had ignited a spark that illuminated the path forward for countless others. In a world often fractured by fear and misunderstanding, they proved that bridges could be built, wounds could heal, and communities as the years passed. The impact of Marcus and Officer Gregg's efforts continued to grow, rippling outward, in ways neither of them could have fully anticipated. What had begun as a single incident, a tense and deeply flawed encounter, had blossomed into a movement that transcended their neighborhood, inspiring similar initiatives across the country. Their story became a beacon of hope for communities grappling with issues of race, policing, and systemic inequality. Proof that meaningful change was possible when people chose empathy over division and collaboration over conflict. The advisory board they helped establish quickly gained traction, evolving into a model for other cities seeking to address long-standing tensions between law enforcement and marginalized communities. Comprised of residents, activists, educators, and officers, the board met regularly to review policies, analyze data, and propose reforms aimed at fostering trust and accountability. One of its earliest successes came when it spearheaded the implementation of body cameras for all officers in the department, ensuring greater transparency in interactions with the public. The move was met with widespread approval, not only from community members but also from many within the force who recognized the importance of rebuilding credibility. In addition to policy changes, the board prioritized education, launching workshops, and training sessions designed to challenge implicit biases and promote cultural competence. These programs weren't limited to law enforcement. They extended to schools, businesses, and civic organizations, creating a culture of inclusivity that permeated every aspect of life in the community. Teachers learned how to recognize and address racial disparities in discipline. Employers adopted hiring practices that emphasized diversity, and local leaders incorporated equity-focused strategies into city planning. Each step forward reinforced the idea that progress required collective effort, not just isolated actions. Marcus remained at the forefront of these efforts, his role expanding beyond advocacy to include mentorship and leadership development. He founded an organization dedicated to empowering young people of color, providing them with resources, guidance, and opportunities to engage in civic activities. Through after-school programs, internships, and networking events, he sought to equip the next generation with the tools they needed to navigate a world still riddled with systemic barriers. "We can't wait for someone else to fix things," he often told his mentees. "If we want a better future, we have to build it ourselves." His work earned him national recognition, culminating in an invitation to speak at a prestigious civil rights summit held in Washington, D.C. Standing on stage before an audience of thousands, Marcus reflected on the journey that had brought him there, the challenges he had faced, the lessons he had learned, and the partnerships he had forged along the way. "Change isn't easy," he said, his voice resonating through the packed auditorium. "It demands courage, patience, and persistence. But most importantly, it requires us to see each other, not as stereotypes or statistics, but as human beings deserving of dignity and respect." His speech received a standing ovation, cementing his status as a leading voice in the fight for social justice. Officer Gregg, too, found himself stepping into new roles as his reputation as a reform advocate grew. He became a sought-after speaker at conferences and seminars, sharing insights gleaned from his experiences and offering practical advice for officers looking to improve community relations. His candor and vulnerability struck a chord with audiences, particularly those skeptical of institutional change. "I'm not here to tell you I have all the answers," he would say during presentations. "What I do know is that doing nothing isn't an option. If we want to earn back the trust we've lost, we have to be willing to listen, learn, and adapt." His transformation wasn't without its critics. Some within law enforcement viewed his outspokenness as a betrayal, accusing him of undermining the profession by airing its flaws in public forums. Others dismissed his efforts as performative, questioning whether his actions were motivated by genuine conviction or a desire for redemption. Despite these detractors, Officer Gregg remained steadfast in his commitment to reform. He understood that true leadership meant staying the course even when it was unpopular, trusting that his actions would speak louder than words in the long run. Back home, the community continued to thrive under the foundation laid by Marcus and Officer Gregg. Annual Unity Day celebrations drew larger crowds each year, becoming a cherished tradition that showcased the diversity and resilience of the neighborhood. Local artists contributed murals, performances, and installations celebrating themes of inclusion and solidarity, while vendors offered food and crafts representing cultures from around the world. The event served as both a celebration of progress and a reminder of the work still to be done, grounding attendees in a shared sense of purpose. Even smaller gestures carried significance. Neighbors who once avoided eye contact now greeted each other warmly, exchanging pleasantries or stopping to chat about shared interests. Block parties and community cleanups fostered connections among residents, breaking down barriers that had, once, seemed insurmountable. Officers patrolling the streets no longer elicited fear or suspicion. Instead, they were seen as partners in maintaining safety and well-being. These shifts might have appeared minor on the surface, but collectively, they signaled a profound transformation in the fabric of the community. For Marcus and Officer Greg, the journey was far from over. Though they had achieved remarkable success, they knew that dismantling systemic racism was a lifelong endeavor, one that required constant vigilance and innovation. They continued to collaborate on projects aimed at addressing emerging challenges, such as affordable housing shortages, educational inequities, and healthcare disparities. By tackling these interconnected issues, they hoped to create a society where everyone had access to the opportunities and resources necessary to thrive. Their partnership also deepened over time, evolving from a professional alliance into a genuine friendship. They spent hours discussing everything from family milestones to philosophical debates, finding common ground despite their vastly different backgrounds. On weekends, they occasionally joined forces to coach youth sports teams, instilling values of teamwork, perseverance, and integrity in the next generation. Watching kids from diverse walks of life come together on the field reminded them of the power of unity and the boundless potential of collaboration. Looking back on their journey, Marcus and Officer Greg often marveled at how much had changed since that fateful evening years earlier. What had started as a moment of confrontation had become a testament to the possibility of reconciliation and growth. They had faced adversity head-on, refusing to let fear or doubt dictate their actions. In doing so, they had not only transformed themselves but also inspired countless others to join the fight for a more equitable world. Their story served as a powerful reminder that no one is defined solely by their mistakes. Officer Greg's willingness to confront his biases and take responsibility for his actions demonstrated that redemption was possible, provided one was open to learning and growth. Similarly, Marcus's resilience in the face of injustice underscored the strength of the human spirit, proving that even in moments of pain and frustration, hope could prevail. Ultimately, their legacy was not measured in accolades or awards, but in the lives they touched and the systems they helped reshape. By choosing to rise above division and embrace empathy, they had ignited a spark that illuminated the path forward for generations to come. And though the road ahead remained fraught with challenges, they walked it together, guided by the belief that a brighter future was within reach, if only they dared to imagine it and work toward it tirelessly. In a world often divided by fear and misunderstanding, Marcus and Officer Greg stood as living proof that bridges could be built, wounds could heal, and communities could unite around a shared vision of justice and hope. Theirs was a story of courage, compassion, and unwavering determination, a story that would continue to inspire long after they were gone.